The Peace and Liberty Podcast, Episode 5. Americans have the right and advantage of being armed, unlike the citizens of other countries whose governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. That was James Madison. Hey everybody, Stephen Clyde here doing a solo episode to finish out the week. It has been a wonderful first week with great guests, and the support has been overwhelming, so thank you all for that. If you care to support what I'm doing, please subscribe down below, tell a friend, and help me bring more people to liberty. You can also donate to me on Patreon and GoFundMe. Links will be at the end of the video and in the show notes page. So I have two announcements to make before I begin, and the first is that I'm going to be giving away a free book every Friday to the most upvoted comment throughout the week. And all you have to do to participate is leave a comment on any video between Monday through Friday, and I'll announce a winner every Friday. My favorite part about being a voice for liberty is not only giving you the resources you need, but to hear what you all have as individuals to say. That being said, my second announcement is that I'm going to be setting up a website called Debate Liberty, in which two people with opposing viewpoints will hash it out in a moderated debate. I'll phrase my proposition to those interested in this way. If you feel you're a good debater and are in command of the facts, show the world what you have to offer by challenging somebody else. We will, of course, promote the debates weeks in advance to have both sides prepare and to allow for a large audience to participate, but it's going to be a ton of fun. Email me at scliberty@protonmail.com if you're interested in being a debater. So, pun intended, today's episode will literally be arming you with knowledge because, of course, we're talking about guns and gun control. Now, guns have been the most popular topic recently on account of the school shooting in Parkland, Florida. On February 14th, 2018, Nicholas Cruz was responsible for the death of 17 students and faculty members at the high school he attended. Immediately, politicians and, to our horror, students came out in support of gun control. What I'd like to do for this episode is not only look at the history behind guns, gun control, and the intent of gun ownership, but to provide you with the information necessary to unclog the minds of friends and family members who don't comprehend this issue clearly. And most of the stuff you can't make up. For example, James Hassan tweeted that in the last 72 hours, we've heard these phrases from politicians and journalists. Fully semi-automatic, gas-assisted receiver firearms, machine gun magazines, high-capacity rapid-fire magazines. AR stands for assault rifle. And if you didn't catch that, AR stands for Armalite, which was the engineering company founded in 1954. So he ends his tweet by saying it's like a Mad Libs game. No kidding. The most common pattern you see among those that denounce guns is a complete lack of knowledge or experience regarding guns. And think about it this way. On one hand, the left will claim that men could never understand a woman's body and therefore can never argue against abortion rationally. Fair enough. If you have never owned a gun, nor have you ever fired one, nor do you have any knowledge regarding them, you are no authority to be telling people if they can or cannot own them. Now, Steven Crowder did a great video a few years ago, which I'll link to, which he set up a table claiming to be an advocate of common sense gun reform, and in which there were multiple types of weapons on the table. Relating back to what I said earlier, take a look.
So are you uncomfortable?
I don't like.
I know, neither. I know. So have you ever fired a firearm?
No.
Oh, perfect. Are you a firearm owner?
No.
Okay.
Well, I won't own one.
Good. So do you own any firearms?
Hell no.
Oh, good. Perfect.
But what kind of guns do they want banned? Let's take a look.
But no one needs, for example, like a fully semi-automatic. So is it because of the magazine capacity?
No, look at it.
Because right. No one's committing mass shootings with these.
Yeah.
Right. Do you think that anyone really needs a handgun in 2016?
Maybe a hunt, or maybe if you're like out in the wilderness.
Okay.
I'll link to the full video, but you get the point. So let's look at some of the history surrounding guns, because one thing you hear a lot is that the founders never intended for us to have these scary looking guns mentioned in the video, which were all semi-automatic, by the way. I can't stress enough that there's an incredible amount of resources available for mostly every topic I cover. Even when it seems like I cover a lot, sometimes I'm only using one or two sources, and for this video I am. So you can imagine how much there is to learn. But for this episode in particular, I'm going to be I'm going to recommend a great little book called The Know Your Bill of Rights book by Sean Patrick. And essentially, it gives a historical analysis of how the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights were ratified. The chapter on the Second Amendment is only a few pages, so go check it out. It's going to read pretty much exactly how I lay it out here. But I do want to touch on one thing before I get into guns, and that is, why has the Constitution become so warped from its original intent? And interestingly, the founder stated over and over that only the expressly delegated powers are the ones that are to be upheld, and everything else is an obstruction of justice and abuse of power. So the idea of implied powers, or in other words, when politicians look at the Constitution and see, I think I see things that are implied there, it essentially means there is no more Constitution because the powers are now endless. For example, it's often said that the General Welfare Clause in the preamble shows that the government's job is there to help us, right? Now, first off, the preamble does not delegate any powers. But also the preamble is meant to represent how the document is to be carried out. With the Constitution in motion, things are to be carried out with the general welfare in mind. That's all it meant. And I'll dedicate other episodes to this, but take, for example, this quote by James Madison, in which he said, "With respect to the words general welfare, I have always regarded them as qualified by the detail of powers connected with them. To take them in a literal and unlimited sense would be a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character, which there is a host of proofs was not contemplated by its creators. If the words obtain so readily a place in the Articles of Confederation and receive so little notice in their admission into the present Constitution, and retain so long a time a silent place in both, the fairest explanation is this: that the words in the alternative of meaning nothing or meaning everything had the former meaning taken for granted." And that was James Madison in a letter to James Robertson Jr., dated April 20th, 1831. I don't know about you all, but I think Madison, who is often considered the father of the Constitution, well, he was perfectly clear there. Perfectly clear. So beginning our discussion in the history, and again, using the book, The Know Your Bill of Rights book by Sean Patrick, we'll look at how the Second Amendment evolved. When tracing where our gun rights came from today, they can be said to have originated back in England in 1689 when they adopted their Bill of Rights. But even before that, in the 12th century, Henry II wanted to ensure that all free men were armed. And a century later, Henry III required those aged 15 to 50 to possess a weapon other than a knife. And interestingly, crown officers would inspect people to make sure they were properly armed. In 1671, Charles II attempted to disarm his opposition. And in 1686, James II banned firearms for Protestants and left them only in the hands of Catholics. This all eventually led to what we know as the Glorious Revolution of 1689, and James II was overthrown by William of Orange. He promised to protect the right to own firearms. So the law he proposed read as follows: that the subjects, which are Protestants, may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. It's important to remember that England at the time was 98% Protestant, so the king would never ever disarm its citizens again. But listen to what people were saying at the time. William Blackstone stated in his commentaries that the right to have arms was indispensable to protect and maintain inviolate the three great primary rights of personal security, personal liberty, and private property. The Articles of Confederation from 1777, which was our first constitution, spoke of well-regulated militias, but didn't speak of individuals' right to bear arms. This was a problem, and everyone knew it because it meant that state law would dictate who would own firearms. But in some cases, this didn't even matter. Think about Pennsylvania's Constitution of 1776 used the phrase, the right to bear arms, and it had no militia. Massachusetts in 1780 didn't limit the right to keep and bear arms to a militia. And Virginia's Declaration of Rights of 1776 talked about a well-regulated militia in place of standing armies. And really think about that. The idea that militias are standing armies goes against exactly what the founders were talking about. They hated standing armies. George III was heavily denounced by the colonists and by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence for using British standing armies to control them. And take this, for example, because it's interesting. James Madison proposed in 1789, and pay attention to the language because this relates to military inscription. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country. But no person religiously scrupulous of being armed shall be compelled to render military service in person. And basically what he was saying is that your unwillingness to join the military is no grounds for taking away your firearms. And Madison would go on to say that this amendment was to be used as a guard for private rights. Richard Henry Lee said, a militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves and include all men capable of bearing arms. George Mason said this, I asked you, sir, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people. And Patrick Henry, of course, spoke of the people defending themselves against an army controlled by Congress. That's what the militia was. It had nothing to do with soldiers walking around harassing others, but in fact, the exact opposite. The people were to be armed to prevent standing armies who would ultimately attempt to disarm them. Now listen to New Hampshire's proposed amendment, which said, Congress shall never disarm any citizen, unless such as are or have been in actual rebellion. And New York stated that people have a right to keep and bear arms, and that a well-regulated militia consisting of the body of the people capable of bearing arms, it he proper defense of a free state. So I'm going to wrap up with some statistics, and of course, you can all research most of this for yourself. Most of it's common knowledge, but when evaluating history or economics, it's always important to remember the question relative to what? What is the conclusion that you're proposing relative to in relation to other things? So for example, it's often stated that on average around 30,000 deaths related to guns. Think about this though. About 65,000 deaths are from drug overdoses, and that was in 2016. 88,000 died from alcohol-related deaths recently in recent years. Upwards of 500,000 people die from heart disease each year, which more than likely stems from obesity. Now, I'm simply painting a picture here to eventually put everything into perspective. How do the gun deaths break down, though? Now, in 2017, there were about 327 million people in the U.S., and according to the CDC, there was about 38,658 gun-related deaths. This is about 0.012% of the population. So looking at the numbers from 2016 alone, we find that 65% of the deaths were suicides. This wouldn't have been prevented by a gun law. 15% are by law enforcement in the line of duty. 17% are through criminal activity, gang and drug related. 3% are accidental discharge deaths. So technically, gun violence is not 30,000 deaths annually, but drops to about 5,100. Now let's look at how that spans across the nation. 480 homicides were in Chicago, which is 9.4%. 344 were in Baltimore, and that's 6.7%. 333 homicides were in Detroit, that's 6.5%. 119 were in DC, that's 2.3%. So what you see here is about 25% of the gun violence happens in 4 cities. It's hard to ignore. So what about the myths, such as Australia banned guns and they have very little gun crime? Well, their crime rate was falling exactly at the same rate before and after the gun ban. And in fact, this is a common trend in history in the way they try to manipulate statistics. For example, the poverty rate in 1950 was 32.2%. And by 1965, when the war on poverty started, it had already been halved to about 17.3%. But looking many years forward, by 2012, it had only dropped to about 15%. Really think about that. Or you'll hear that England banned guns and had a lower crime rate. Well, in fact, England's crime rate soared after the 1997 gun ban and didn't start to fall really till 2002. And for the record, there were over 500 acid attacks alone in 2016 in England. So the point is that people find other ways to harm one another. Well, how about the mass shooting myth? Well, it does seem true that school shootings are happening now at a higher rate, and that in, say, my parents' generation, the same types of school shootings weren't happening. But when we're talking about mass shootings as the media defines it, we're speaking about 3 or more people injured in a situation where a gun was involved. When you hear that, there were 355 mass shootings last year. It's important to note that in about half of those situations, not a single person died. Or how about the good guy with a gun myth? Yet even the CDC states that guns are used to prevent upwards of millions of times a year in crimes. So the figures are hard to ignore. So does this all surprise you? No matter what way you look at it, deaths are down from weapons overall. In 2009, there were 13,752 deaths related to weapons. And in 2014, that was already brought down to 11,961. It's not as if the population isn't growing. So how do we break down these numbers? Well, in 2010, for example, there were 6,115 deaths from firearms, 367 from rifles, and 366 from shotguns. Now, take into consideration that 1,732 people were killed by knives. So adding up all the people killed from rifles and all the people killed from shotguns that year, it wouldn't even add up to half of the number of victims of knives. Looking at the same statistics, but for the year 2014, we see that 5,562 people were killed by handguns, 248 by rifles, and 262 by shotguns. Now, 1,567 were killed by knives. Again, in 2014, deaths by rifles and shotguns didn't amount to a third of the numbers of victims of knives. So why does this matter? Well, the debate today is regarding rifles, namely AR-15s, which, by the way, are just civilian-grade versions of the M4 and M16. They keep saying they do not want to ban guns, yet they're the first people that would say we don't want to ban knives. Of course not. But looking at the statistics in 2014, they're 3 times more dangerous. So why are everyone's minds clogged in this issue? It is emotional to hear about kids being shot and killed, but there are a lot of things we end up not talking about as a result. How about the fact that in 26 out of 27 of the last school shootings, the shooter came from a broken home and without a father? One last thing I'll touch on is how disarming the citizens was a much too common theme in communist and fascist regimes. Take the Khmer Rouge, for example, and if you ever watch the movie First They Killed My Father, which is based on the true story of a young girl being taken away to work on a collective farm and her whole family was taken away. You notice that as the people were being taken away, all the guns are rallied and brought to the center of the village. They were disarmed first and foremost. And of course, Hitler disarmed his citizens, and so did Stalin and Mao. But I hope you all can take this information and use it to shut down these talking heads because they want to strip away your liberties. The right to self-defense is a negative right, and it comes from the idea that you have a right not to be harmed and have your property violated. So I hope this has been helpful, and be on the lookout because next week will be dedicated to women in libertarianism, and I have 5 great guests who break through that stereotype that libertarianism is only for white males. Well, I'll tell you what, peace and liberty is for everybody who respects property rights and other people in general. It's colorblind. It's not PC. Spread the word, guys. This is Stephen Clyde here for the Peace and Liberty Podcast. See you next week. Hey everyone, please like, follow, donate, subscribe, and share. Any donations will be used to reach more people.